Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm using the new Hero Arts Fresh Flowers collection to create some stunning floral cards using Hero Arts Reactive inks. We have the Sweet Blooms die, the Floral Frame Die Set, as well as a coordinating layering stencil set to color it or to use it on its own. We have the Perfect Pairs Stampin' Cut, lots of different sentiment possibilities and combinations in here, as well as coordinating dies for those larger words. And then we have the Organic Shapes Stamp Set, perfect for creating texture on your die cuts or stamped images or on the backgrounds. I'm going to start off by creating some sentiments. I'm using some black Raven cardstock here, and I'm going to stamp and heat emboss my sentiments with white embossing powder. Before I do anything with those stamp sets, because they're brand new, I'm using a white eraser on the stamping surface. This just removes any possible manufacturing residue and helps that stamp take ink just a little bit better. This only needs to be done one time, the very first time you use the stamp set. Once it's done, you never need to do this again. Then I use a brush to remove any possible eraser bits that are sticking in between each one of those letters to make sure it's nice and clean before we do our stamping. I'm going to start with the larger words first, placing them on my cardstock here, making sure that we have some space between them to make sure that I can easily die cut them in one pass and get all of those dies on there. I'm using my Misti stamping tool so that I can stamp it a couple times to make sure I have a nice, crisp, clean stamped sentiment here. I'm also using some embossing powder tool on my cardstock so that when I pour my embossing powder on there, it should only stick to that VersaMark ink that I'm stamping with. So I ink up my stamp with that VersaMark ink, press really well to make sure that we have a nice transfer of that ink. Stamp it once again just to make sure we haven't missed any areas. Then we can pull it out of the Misti stamping tool and we can pour that embossing powder on there. I pour it on there over top of a scrap piece of paper so any of that excess can just go right back into the container. There's no waste here. Now, if by chance you have little dots of that embossing powder sticking where you don't want it to go, before melting it, just use a soft brush to remove that. That way we don't accidentally melt the powder where we don't want it. I'm using my heat embossing tool. You'll see it go from like a matte granular look to a glossy white. You could easily do metallic inks here if you prefer. I just thought I would do the black cardstock with the bold white sentiment on it for this particular selection of cards. Now I'm going to repeat that same process, but I'm using the sub sentiments for this one. I'm going to be using different sentiments that I think are going to work with those larger words that I've chosen. I'll also do a few extra ones. Any extra ones, I'll just save them with this stamp set. I typically like having excess so that I have lots of choice while I'm creating, because sometimes I'll change my mind on what I want to do, and it's always nice to have that done rather than having to stop and create another sentiment. So I'm repeating the same process, making sure I have some space between those sentiments. These ones don't have dies to go with them, so they're going to need to be trimmed with my guillotine trimmer, but I want to make sure that I have some space between them so I can cut them nicely. And once again, I use some embossing powder tool on my cardstock. I also stamped it a couple times to make sure we have a nice crisp sentiment here. Pouring that white embossing powder, and I'm using super fine embossing powder. I typically like super fine embossing powders for sentiments. It just gives you some cleaner lines and some crisper sentiments. If you don't have super fine powder, you can use the regular powder, but if you ever do a sentiment with regular powder and then do it with superfine, you can definitely see a difference between the two. Once we have those heat embossed, we can die cut our larger words to have those ready to go. And I like to tape those in place with some Best Ever Craft tape to make sure they don't move on me while I'm doing my die cutting. And just like that, we have all of our sentiments die cut. We can set that to the side, ready to go for when we're creating our cards. Now for my sub sentiments, I like to use that clear finger guard on my trimmer, and I will line up the edge of the sentiment to the right side so I could just see a little bit of that sentiment on the outside of that ruler. I'll flip it to the other side, do exactly the same thing, but making sure that it's nice and even with my silver piece of the blade, I guess, underneath that, and then I do the two edges. So we'll do all of those. We'll have those set to the side. Now for these cards, I'm using some Hero Arts Reactive inks. I have the little ink cubes. I don't have space to hold larger pads anymore. I have a small area that I work in. So I have them all set to the side. Now these are water reactive inks. I'm using them for their brightness, the vibrancy, and their color. I'm not necessarily using them for their water reactiveness. They're fairly similar to 2 like oxide inks. They are a hybrid ink, but you can use whatever inks you want if you prefer to use other inks. I have some detail blending brushes because I'm using some smaller pads. I'm not going to use larger brushes with them, as well as the fact that I want my flowers to be darker towards the centers, lighter towards the outside, and I have a little bit more control with these smaller brushes using them on these stencils for the flowers. The first color I'm using here is Taffy, and again, I'm inking my brush starting towards the center of the flower, and then as there's less ink on my brush, I'm working my way towards the outside of the flower. Now, there are layers in this stencil that will put some centers to these flowers, so it's not going to be just this layer on its own. There's also a coordinating die set that we can use for adding extra layers on these if we want to. So I'm going to be doing these cards with this stencil set as well as the coordinating die set in a few different ways, just to give you a few different ideas on how to use it. This first card here, I'm just using it on its own. This second color here I'm using is some blue Hawaii. It's a nice navy blue. Once we have our first layer done, and you can see that I put some painter's tape towards my top left of my stencil and the bottom right, it's just going to help me layer those stencils and line them up easily. And you only need to do those 2 corners. You don't necessarily need to do all 4 corners. You could if you wanted, but if you've got those 2 corners lined up, the rest of everything is going to be lined up. And I have my sticky mat holding my paper in place so I know that it's not going to move on me. This next color here is Purple Galaxy. I'm doing the same method as I did for the Taffy. I'm starting with my brush on the center of the flower, working my way out so it's darker towards the center, lighter towards the outside of the flower. Now I have 6 brushes for my reactive inks, 1 per color family. Any of the purples, I'll just use the same brush rather than having 1 brush per pad. This just makes it easier. And I'm choosing to make the centers of my flowers darker than the outside parts of my flowers, just because it gives some visual interest. I prefer the look. I like when my ink blending has some light areas and dark areas. I think it looks just a little bit more interesting. If you prefer, you could always just do the same amount of ink and have it a little bit more flat. It just really depends on the look that you're going for. So with that second one done, we're ready to add the third layer of our stencil. Here I'm using some Lemon Drop for a nice bright, vibrant pop of color here. And you could really use any color combination or any combination of colors here if you wanted. I just chose a bunch of the reactive inks that I thought would look lovely together, perfect for spring or summer cards. You could easily use fall tones if you wanted to create some fall colors or some fall cards with them. I think the sky's the limit. The flowers are generic enough that you don't necessarily have to use specific colors for them. Once again, I'm grabbing the blue Hawaii for the flower centers. Now you could also use black here. I don't have a black of my reactive inks here, and I didn't really want to pull in another ink pad for this, so I just thought I would use that blue. I think it does give it a really interesting look to it. Another option would be to say use that Purple Galaxy for some of the centers if you wanted. For the leaves, I'm using this Key Lime Fizz. This is the only green that I have in these reactive inks. So in order to get a little bit more of a deeper color towards the base of my leaves, I'm going to add a little bit of blue Hawaii just to give it a little bit more depth, a little bit more interest to it. It's also going to coordinate with the centers of the flowers. It's going to blend in with that Key Lime Fizz, and I really love the final look of it. Just because you have a certain color palette in your possession doesn't mean you can't combine some of those colors together just to create new colors and expand that color palette. And it makes you think a little bit more creatively sometimes when you have a little bit more of a limited palette, which is always nice to stretch those creative muscles there. So we have our background done. The last thing I want to do is add a little bit of stickles in the centers of some of those flowers. Now I could have used some Stickles glitter gel, which I will regularly use with stencils, but because I wanted to use them on the centers of those flowers, and some of those centers are divided between a couple different stencils, I opted to just use it from my smaller bottle with a finer tip. That way I have a little bit more control over it. I let that dry for probably about a half an hour, and now I'm going to trim this down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I didn't want to trim too much of it down because I didn't want to trim all those florals off. For this card, I'm using some Raven cardstock for my mat, and I'm trimming that to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. So our mat itself is just a little bit smaller. I'm keeping this card really quite simple with just that stenciled background and the mat, and then we're going to add our sentiments over top of it. I'm gluing everything together with Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. This works perfectly for gluing my different layers together, but it's also going to work perfectly for gluing my die cuts down, which is especially going to come into play when we use the floral die cuts as well as little floral centers. For this card, I'm going to just create a congrats card. So I used the congrats larger sentiment, and then I added a you did it smaller sentiment to the bottom of that. I use an acrylic block to hold everything in place when I'm gluing things. It just keeps everything nice and flat, frees up my hands for working with other things. We don't use those stamping blocks very often anymore, so we might as well have a use to them. For the next card, I have my die cut here out of Hammermill cardstock. This is from that Floral Frame Die Set. I have little pieces on the inside of it. Those are extra dies that are in that set. I'm not going to be stenciling those. There's no stencil for those. I will be inking those on their own. But the stencil itself is fairly easy to line up with the die cut edges. The die cut lines are easy to see. I do add that painter's tape to those corners again to line them up, but in general, it's much easier to line this up than it is to line up just a piece of cardstock that you're doing the stenciled edges on. So I'm going in with Berry Smoothie for these flowers. Now again, I'm using the same color palette, but I'm changing up which flowers are which color just to change up the backgrounds. I didn't want all of the backgrounds to look exactly the same for these cards. So we'll have the same color palette, but the different flowers are going to have different colors. And once again, going heavier towards the center of the flowers, lighter towards the outside edges for the flowers. And I especially love this with florals. I love when florals have that different color variation with the deeper shades on the inside of the petals. To change up those colors just a little bit, I'm adding a little bit of that purple galaxy to the inside of these flowers. Again, there's nothing saying that you can't add different colors over top of each other to change up the color palette or color tones. You just want to work with colors that are close together on the color wheel. So I wouldn't want to go take purple flower or orange flower, say, and add purple to it, because we're going to end up with brown. If you don't work with colors on the opposite side of the color wheel, you're going to end up with brown and muddy colors. So if you're working with ones that are closer together, you're going to have a better success rate. Once again, I use that blue Hawaii in the flower centers that are on that first stencil there. Now we're lining up the second stencil, and I'm kind of ignoring my painter's tape, working with the die cut lines instead, because those are a little bit more accurate, and again, easy to see, so why not? For this one, I'm using the lemon drop on the second layer of the stencil. Now, I have the center part of my die cut still in place. This is so that my die cut itself doesn't warp. Because it's a frame, it would be too easy for it to warp on my sticky mat and not have those pieces line up. The easiest way to make sure everything was going to line up properly is to have it all together, have that inside part holding everything together. Next, we're going to add some fruit punch. This is more of an orange color. It's kind of in a corally orange. Add it over top of that yellow just to change the centers of the flowers. I don't do a lot of oranges and yellows, and I've said this before because they're not really my favorite colors, but when we're working with florals, sometimes it's nice to have that pop of yellow or orange in amongst the pinks and purples that I tend to be a little bit more comfortable with or tend to lean towards, to just add that pop of color. Next, we have the taffy, and I'm going with this layer here. I am going to do the flower centers again with that blue Hawaii to add that bit of contrast. The purple galaxy would also be a good alternative, although I wouldn't do the purple galaxy on top of the purple galaxy centered flowers, because you're not really going to see it as much. You'll see the blue Hawaii just a little bit better. And as you can see, stenciling on top of the die cut frame as opposed to just Hammermill cardstock is really not much different than just doing it on top of the Hammermill cardstock. It's much easier to line these pieces up because we have those die cut lines, whereas when I'm just using a flat sheet of paper, I would use the painter's tape to help line those pieces up. Once again, I'm using the key lime fizz for my leaves. I'm going to add a little bit of that blue Hawaii to the bases of the leaves just to deepen that color a little bit. If you like that bright green, you could absolutely leave it as is, but I do think adding that little bit of blue Hawaii just adds a little bit of dimension to it, a little bit of color variation, deepens that green. Sometimes with these greens, I think they're just a little bit too bright. Perfect for spring, I think, but when it comes to summer, when colors are a little bit deeper and not quite as bright to them, I think that adding that blue is a little bit more interesting, as well as the fact that it's not really expected to have the blue in the leaves, so I like that aspect of it as well. Once we have our leaves done, we have all of our stenciling done for this particular die cut piece. So now we can pull that off of our sticky mat and we can pull that die cut out of there. You can see once we get that die cut pulled out of there, it's really quite delicate, and that's why I kept that piece in there to make it stay nice and uniform while stenciling. It would be much easier to do it that way than to stencil it on its own. And as you can, or when I'm putting it on my background here, you'll see that it just kind of moves on its own because we don't have a lot of space keeping it a rectangle shape. I'm using some Oceanside cardstock on the background for this one. I love the color, or the bright colored florals on top of that Oceanside. You could swap that with black if you wanted, but I didn't want to do black for the backgrounds for all of my cards. I really love the look of that deep, dark Oceanside blue. So as we put that die cut on our background, because we use that liquid glue, we can move and make sure that everything is lined up around the outside edges of our card. Love the look of those pieces. Now, when I was pulling the die cut out of the center, I forgot that there's a few little inside die cut pieces. Fortunately, I didn't put any glue on them. It was easy enough to take the die cut or the die pick from the handy tool set and just pick out those pieces easily enough. I'm turning this one into a happy birthday card here. I'm going to start with the center sentiment to make sure that's in the center of the card. Then we will add the sub sentiment underneath there, and then the happy on top of that, making sure that everything is lined up nicely. Now, you could easily change this into a horizontal card if you want. I do mostly vertical cards. It just tends to be my preference, but you obviously can change them up and do them or swap them really, really easily. Last step here, I'm going to add some of the stickles to the centers of those flowers. I really love adding stickles to the center of the flowers, and I use one that's just a clear iridescent, so we still see the ink underneath it, but it adds that texture of the glitter as well as that sparkle. And by having that little bit of extra texture to it, it takes it to the next level rather than having a flat die cut. I always love to add or find ways to add extra texture to my cards. Now, those die cut pieces that I had inside that die cut frame there, I'm going to ink blend them. I also did a bunch of extra ones so that we have lots to choose from. I'm going to be using them for my next two cards, and I wanted to make sure that I had lots and lots of choice. So my method for inking these is fairly simple to my stenciled outside pieces. I am being heavier with my ink towards the center of the flowers, lighter towards the outside petals of those flowers. We also have a ton of flower centers to the left side of my mat there. So we're going to have something in that center, so we don't have to have perfect ink blending in the center. So for those first flowers, I started off with the lemon drop. Then I'm doing the key lime fizz on the leaves. You can see that my ink blending is fairly similar to doing the stenciling, so I'm kind of cutting some of it out. I used the blue Hawaii on the flower centers and also on the bases of the leaves, using the same brushes that I was using for the stenciling. These work perfect, and having these die cuts on a sticky mat holds them in place perfectly for doing all of this. I can clean that sticky mat off once I'm done. I don't need to clean in between. Next, we're going to do the berry smoothie for these particular flowers here. I'm going to add a little bit of that purple galaxy in the center just to change the color tone of them a little bit. And lastly, we're going to do some taffy on those last flowers that I have to the bottom right of my mat. Once we have all of those pieces ink blended, I'm leaving everything on my sticky mat, and I'm going to start to glue the centers to the flowers. I'm using my reverse tweezers to hold those die cuts in the tweezers, add the glue to the back, and then I'll release them once I put them on the flower that I want them to go to. These are much easier for this particular application than using other tweezers. Other tweezers, you have to hold them shut. These ones, you don't have to hold them shut because they're reverse tweezers. You squeeze them in order to release that die cut. So for something like this, the reverse tweezers are absolutely perfect. Once I have all of my flower centers in place, I can move those to the side, and I move them to the side in piles based on the type of flower. I'm going to be using this with a stenciled frame that I did off screen, changing up the colors just a little bit. I have some Oceanside cardstock that I trimmed down to 4 1/8 inch by 5 3/8 inch, and my stenciled image I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Then I'm going to glue those to my A2 card base. For this particular card, I'm using the Thanks sentiment that comes with the Sweet Blooms die set. I'll be using it in another card as well, and in that one I'll be assembling it. This one I had already assembled, and I wanted to combine my stenciled frame with some of those floral die cuts. Those floral die cuts are going to fill that in just a little bit more. It's also going to add that die cut dimension that we get from it, so it's just going to change it up a little bit. So just because you have the two together doesn't mean they need to be used together. You can use them in different ways, and I love the fact that there are extra florals in that floral frame die set so that you can use them in this way. You can use that stencil set to color those florals from the dies or from the die cuts. You can also use it for just that background. It just gives you so many more options for using it this way. Now, I'm not going to fill this in completely. I'm saving some of these florals for my next card as well. I just wanted to fill it in a little bit just to add that little bit of extra texture. It's a little bit of pop of color. So I'm choosing some of those yellow florals that I don't have on my stenciled background. A few of those pinks are going to tie in with what I do have on my stenciled background just to keep it cohesive and make it match, but add that extra little bit or a little bit of pop of color. I have that thanks sentiment that I'm going to add to the center, and this one again is going to be a vertical card, but you could easily swap it out and make a horizontal card if you prefer. By using the liquid glue on the back of these die cuts, it makes it really easy to put them in place, slide them in place, and then tuck those leaves where I feel it needs a little bit of extra greenery. I can also use that glue for adding my sentiment. I chose one of the sub-sentiments from that Perfect Pair stamp and cut set that I created earlier. It works perfectly with my die cut thanks sentiment as well. And here we have another quick and simple card. The thing that takes longest really is the stenciled background and stenciling those florals. But if you're doing a bunch of them at a time, it comes together really quickly, and I think it's really effective. Now, you could also use colored cardstock instead of doing that ink blending, but you get such a beautiful look with that ink blending. Last step is adding the stickles to the center of the flowers. Again, I just like that extra sparkle, that extra little bit of texture to it. Depending on how much stickles you need to, or you decide to use, will depend on drying time. It typically will take, I want to say, 15 minutes to half an hour, again, depending on how much. Here I decided to add it to that thanks sentiment over top of that white cardstock just to give that a little bit of extra sparkle. That's a thicker coat than what I put on the center of the flower. So for this particular card, that's going to take the longest to dry, and I probably would leave it aside for about an hour. And once it's done, that glue from the glitter glue is going to completely reduce, and we're going to just see some beautiful glitter, and it's going to coordinate with the sparkle that we have on those flower centers. For my next card, I'm once again using that Floral Frame Die Set with some Hammermill cardstock. I'm going to die cut that frame, but for this one, I'm not going to color it at all. I'm going to leave it the white. I'm going to put it on some Oceanside cardstock, so it's just going to create a really beautiful, elegant frame. And we're going to combine a few of those colored or inked floral die cuts that I did to use with my last card. I'm going to combine it with these white die cuts, and it creates a really beautiful look to it. So I have another piece of Oceanside cardstock, again 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 on my A2 card base, and we're going to glue our frame onto that. Now, by adding the glue to the back, we can put as much or as little in the different areas that we need. I do work fairly quickly because I don't want my glue to start drying before I add it to my background. Again, another option would be to use a sheet adhesive to put on the back of the cardstock ahead of time and create basically a die cut sticker, but by doing that, it makes it a little bit harder to move the different areas in place. So by using a liquid glue, it makes it a little bit easier to be able to get perfect placement of that die cut. Once we have that perfectly placed, we can start to add the extra things to the rest of our card. My Oceanside cardstock here, I think, was just a hair slightly or a hair bigger than the 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. But that glue, having that liquid glue to be able to move and shimmy everything in place really is quite handy and makes it so you can get perfect placement. So I'm going to add my sentiment to the center of my card. Then I'm going to start to add my florals. Now I'm going to tuck a few of them behind my sentiment so that that is kind of the focal point here. But then any of the extra ones I'll put in amongst my florals on my frame just to tie that in a little bit. And in the end, I just love the combination of plain white die cuts with those ink blended ones. You could even take those white die cuts and just add some really subtle, say like cream ink blending to add that visual dimension to it, but not add a ton of color to it. But I really love the white ones, the stark white with those florals. I think it makes those colors really pop. Once we have the ones that I want around my sentiment, then I can start to take those extra ones and put them outside of the frame. And you can see we don't have a ton of them left. I wanted to make sure that I had enough to tie in the frame around the outside, but not too much. I wanted, again, the focal to be that sentiment on the inside, and then the outside pieces just to kind of be a complement to them. We're going to add those florals. Some of them I'll put right on top of the white die cut. Some of them I'm tucking underneath that white die cut. I can't say enough. I just love the combination. I've never done white floral die cuts with ink blended die cuts before, and I think I need to do that more because I just really love the final look of this one here, especially with that Oceanside background to it. I think if the background was a lighter color, it wouldn't have such a beautiful contrast to it. Once I have the florals in place, I can take the remaining leaf die cuts and add those behind there, and here is that finished result there. Now you can add some stickles to the centers of those flowers if you choose to. I opted to leave them off of this card just to keep it nice and simple because I think we have enough going on with the floral die cuts. Here we have that thanks sentiment, and I did the shadow with the Raven cardstock, the actual sentiment with some white cardstock, and I love the look of the dark shadow with the light letters. Now you could easily do ink blending on the letters if you want them to be colored. I'm going to be doing the ink blending on my florals. This is the Sweet Blooms die set here, but it complements and works well with the rest of the collection, and I really love the look of the different colors on the white die cuts. So I have 4 florals here. I'm starting with the Lemon Drop. Just like the other ones, I'm being heavier towards the centers of the flowers, lighter towards the edges of those florals. Then I'm going in with some Fruit Punch in the center of that one. Next we have some Taffy. Nope, this is Berry Smoothie. Again, heavier towards, or in the center, lighter towards the outside edges. And as you can see, my ink blending is really similar to what I've been doing for the rest of the video. The leaves are a different shape, obviously, and I'm using that Key Lime Fizz once again, but then I'm going to go in with that Blue Hawaii just to make it a little bit darker. Now, if you didn't want to do this much ink blending, again, you could use colored cardstock if you want, but it's not going to have quite the same look as it does when you do that ink blending. Those tiny little strips that you see towards the left side of my mat are the centers of the little spines to the leaves. Those get glued on afterwards. Now to add a little bit of extra texture to my flowers, I'm going to use that Organic Shapes stamp set. I'm going to use the little dot kind of one, and I'm going to add, or I'm going to stamp that texture onto those florals. So I'm using my eraser on that stamp set because I hadn't used it before this, making sure that that stamp's going to take ink really well. Now I'm going to use that on the florals, and I'm going to use a few of those blobs on the background just to add some color to my background. I have a small stamping block here that I can use to just add that extra texture. Now I ended up grabbing my black memento pad just to stamp that texture on there. It was just sitting on my desk. I think I would prefer it if it was the Blue Hawaii ink from the little mini ink cubes, but I chose the black so that it would coordinate with the black on my thanks sentiment. Really, it doesn't necessarily matter. I just wanted to add a little bit of texture to those flowers and find a different way to use some of the texture stamps, or one of the texture stamps in that Organics stamps set. So I ink that stamp set, kind of position it towards the middle so that most of the dotting is towards the centers of the flowers. Now we can add these centers, and I just kept them white just so that we had a nice stark contrast. We can add the centers to the flowers, and we can add the spines to the leaves, and then we can start working on the background to the card. And I keep those stems, florals, and leaves all separate and assemble them on that background. I don't want to assemble it before time and have something positioned where I don't necessarily like it on the background. I have a little bit more freedom if I do it afterwards. So I have a piece of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch hammer mill cardstock here. I'm going to stamp one of those little blobs with that Key Lime Fizz ink pad. Then I'm going to choose a different organic shape from that stamp set, and I'm going to stamp that with the Blue Hawaii. Now I'm keeping this fairly close to the center. I want to see a little bit of this color behind my florals, but I don't necessarily want to see a ton of it. You could put it a little bit towards the outside edge if you want, but again, I wanted it to add some color behind, but I didn't want it to detract from my florals, and I just love the vibrancy of the florals. So I wanted the focus to be on that. So you'll see a tiny bit of that color. You're not going to see a ton of it. You could easily go a little bit farther out if you wanted. Once I have the background stamped, I'm taking my black cardstock there. I trim that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I end up trimming my background here down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So the margins for these are a little bit bigger than they are for the other ones. The other ones, because I was using that floral frame, I wanted less of it cut off. This, because we're using those florals and they're going to be focused on the inside of the card, I didn't mind cutting as much of that or more of that background off than I did for the others. So I'm going to glue those florals down, and then as I'm gluing them down, I'm adding the stems to them. I wanted to make sure that I had room to insert the stems underneath them, so I didn't want to do all of my florals first and then do my stems. If any of them happen to be a little bit too long, you can always just snip a little bit off of the top of the stem if you wanted to shorten it a little bit, because that end is going to be under the floral. You're never going to see it, so it doesn't matter if it looks pretty in any way, shape, or form or not. And then we can glue the next florals on, and again, the next stem, and so on and so on. Once we have both our florals and our stems on there, then I'm going to start inserting the leaves. It's much easier to see once everything is assembled where it would be nice to have some leaves filling everything in rather than doing it as you're assembling. The one thing you want to make sure though is as you're doing that, put the darker part of the leaf down first. You can see that one on the top left there. I accidentally put it in the wrong way and had the darker part sitting out. It looked a little bit odd until we fixed it. Then we can add that last leaf on there and then add our thanks sentiment to the bottom of it. Now I'll typically put my sentiments over top of the stems because to me, when we're doing florals, the stems is the least interesting part of it. Once we have that thanks on there, we can add that sub sentiment underneath there. In this case here, it definitely helps to have that acrylic block to put on top of there to hold that sentiment down nice and flat while it's drying. And while that's drying, we might as well add a little bit of stickles to the center of the flower so we can have that drying at the same time. Here is the final result. I just love those bold blooms there and that nice bold thanks sentiment on there. You can see a little bit of our organic shapes behind there. It just kind of looks a little bit like greenery. And again, you could expand that out if you wanted to see a bit more of that color, but I wanted the focal point to be those blooms there. Then we have our combination of ink blended flowers with those white flowers on top of that Oceanside background. And because the sentiments from the Perfect Pair Sentiments stamp set have so many different variations to them, you really have a nearly endless combination at your disposal. This next one there was the stenciled background with the floral die cuts on top of it, followed by our floral frame die cut that is stenciled to color on the Oceanside cardstock. Then we have our very first one, super simple but very elegant, with those floral stenciled on the background and our very simple sentiment in front of it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.